Hey everyone. So, what we are going to be doing here is continuing with our discussion of the money market. All right. Uh, Video before was a little bit older. All right. And I'm redoing now a newer part of this. So, I may add a little bit more context to this graph. And I may, yeah, tell about how it's kind of used now. All right. So, let's talk here about the shifters for the money market. So remember, if we talk about our money market graph here, we had the following. All right, we have our quantity of money, QM. We have our interest rates up there as our y-axis. We have a downward sloping demand for money, M sub D, or you could do big D sub M, and a vertical money supply. Okay. So the money market graph, to provide a little bit more context, is where we first start introducing the idea of monetary policy, how the Fed conducts and monetary policy to expand or contract the economy and set interest rates. Okay. So I talked about the money demand shifters, talking about how one of our shifters, change in price level. If we have more price level, people are going to demand more money. I talked about a change in income and real GDP in the same type of way. If incomes are higher, price levels going to be higher, end up becoming higher, and thus more demand for money. And I also talked about a change in technology in the last video. I've actually stopped teaching that one. There are still a lot of textbooks that teach that way, but it's out of date at this point. We're not really having a change in technology affect the demand for money because, as we know at this point now, money is a lot more than just cash. All right. We're talking about the money available out there. So if you wrote that in your notes, I would delete that from your notes and scratch out that third shifter there for the money demand. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the money supply here. All right. And the shifters of this. All right. So, yeah. As I said, the money supply in the last video is set by the Fed. And really, what they're trying to do is either increase the money supply, which would lead to interest rates lowering and thus aggregate demand going up. And the opposite being a decrease in the money supply would lead to interest rates going up and thus aggregate demand dropping. Okay. So that is the principle of it. Again, remember the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed's goals, which is the central bank of the US, is to have stable prices, full employment, and then as a third goal, economic growth. But stable prices, full employment. Okay. So I may erase this here, and I may talk about our couple shifters of the money supply. Shifters of MS. And I may tell you this here, and I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end. This is a little out of date. Okay. It is not what the Fed is currently doing and what has been doing for the last 10, 15 years or so. All right. Uh, it still could do these things. These things are still economic sound principles. There are countries that do this, but at least in the state of the US, it's not been the most recent ways that they conduct policy. All right. So I'm going to talk about two of these shifters. There is a third out there that you'd often see in textbooks, but again, due to what's actually currently going on, I am not going to teach that here. All right. So number one would be the reserve requirement ratio. Okay. If we recall, that is the percentage of deposits, all right, those demand deposits that banks must hold. Okay. And if you're thinking about this, all right, well, if you remember our bank balance sheets, when a deposit goes in, the banks can loan out that money. And that's ultimately because of the money multiplier, what increases the money supply out there. Okay. So it used to be the case that, Fed could change the reserve requirement ratio, and that would increase or decrease the money supply. Okay. Meaning the idea that, hey, if you decrease that reserve requirement ratio, all right, that is going to lead to the money supply increasing because now not the Fed, the banks can loan out more money. And the opposite, if you increase, all right, which I realize I misspelled in decrease there, the reserve requirement ratio, all right, now the Fed or banks can't loan out as much money, so the money supply is going to shrink. All right. Pretty straightforward there. But again, since really '08 and the financial crisis, the Fed has not chosen to really change the reserve requirement ratio. If you remember at all here that the reserve requirement ratio is actually 0%. It used to be 10%. Right now it's at 0. Okay. So what the Fed really started doing instead, and again, a little still outdated, and I'll explain why, is the idea of what's called open market operations. And the Fed still does this. It's just not their main tool for monetary policy. But the idea of open market operations is the fact that the Fed um, will buy and sell bonds. Okay. So let me talk through this. All right. Banks have bonds and treasury bonds on their balance sheet. All right. Well, let's say that the Fed decides to buy bonds. What effect does that have on the marketplace and the money market here? Well, if the Fed buys bonds, if I'm the Fed and you out there are banks, okay, I, as the Fed, buy some bonds from you. All right. I'm buying the bonds away from the bank there, Bank of America, Chase, whatever. Your individual student bank, whatever. All right. The bank there, I buy that. I have to give you cash in reserve term. Well, that means there is more cash available for you as a bank that you can now lend out. So, what does that do? That increases the money supply because now there is more money available in the system. And again, it's not about all the money that's printed, it's about money that is available in the system. And in the opposite way, let's say the Fed sells bonds. Okay. So again, I'm the Federal Reserve. You guys are the bank. All right. I, as the Federal Reserve, sell bonds to you all. You guys now on your balance sheets have a bunch of bonds. All right. And what did you give me in return? You had to give me cash. You had to give me something in return for that money, that cash. All right. With that, now as the Fed, I don't need to re-release that money out there, and thus I shrink the money supply. So the money supply in this case, I should add here, where's my other pen? A money supply increase is a shift right. All right. And the money supply decrease is the shift left. Okay. And with that, that creates a unequilibrium, and the equilibrium changes, and interest rates would rise or sell or drop. Now, there's one more thing I want to introduce here from a terminology standpoint and just talk about quickly is what we call the federal funds rate. Which is a specific interest rate. And that is called the federal funds rates. And what it is banks can borrow and lend from each other. They can do that from the Fed. They can also do that from other banks. All right. And the federal funds rate is specifically the interest rate that banks charge one another for 1 day loans and their interest. All right. And something that I want to make clear here is that the Federal Reserve can't tell banks what interest rates to use. All right. They only can target these federal fund rates and Fed target interest rates out there. But they, as the Fed sets rich interest rates, they drop at a point, low or raise at a point. That's not saying this is the interest rate by law out there. It is a specific interest rate, and that they target, and then other banks will follow along. Okay, and that affects mortgage rates, all sorts of different range that you have out there. Okay, so that is the money supply shifters for the money market. All right. Your next draft after this will be the ample reserves market. And that in that video, I will explain how some of this is still relevant, but a little bit out of date as it is not the main source. All right. Again, still useful, still sound economics. It's just not the main tool that the Fed is always using right now. So hope you had a great day and let me know if you have any questions.